Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me today at the EL Civics conference. And this presentation is EL Civics Remote Assessment Procedures. My name is Rita Van Dyke Cow. I'll be your presenter today. I'm a faculty coordinator and ESL department chair at Santiago Canyon College, which is part of the Rancho Santiago Community College District. All right, let's get started. So here are our objectives for today. We're going to identify the procedures for administering EL Civics remote assessments. And we'll also spend some time gathering ideas on how to present test questions during an EL Civics remote assessment. So just some background. As I mentioned, I am at RSCCD at a non-credit continuing education division at Santiago Canyon College. And our district actually has two colleges, so we work very closely together. And our district decided to participate in the initial pilot project for EL Civics remote assessments. So this was back in spring of 2020, right after the pandemic was declared. We jumped right into the remote assessments of EL Civics. So some of the co-ops that we have tested remotely since then are listed there: safety, family problems, recreation, health, citizenship preparation, nutrition, and most recently online communication. So you can see there's quite a variety here. And I'm going to be sharing some ways that we've remotely assessed these tasks in all of these co-ops. So for these co-ops, there's both written and oral assessments. And we took a kind of different approach depending on the type of assessment. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. All of our assessors used Zoom because these assessments need to be done synchronously. And so that was the video conferencing platform that we decided to use, and it turned out very well. And while our assessor was on Zoom with a student, we decided to use either PowerPoint slides to display the test questions and instructions, or Google Forms. Sometimes we did one or the other, or we would give the instructor a choice, and then the assessor would utilize that format that the instructor requested. And just a note here, it's really important that before you get started with EL Civics remote testing, you have to make sure that you follow a few procedures. One thing we wondered is, how much time is this going to take? How much time do our instructors need to spend assessing students, and how will that take away from their instructional time? So we had some classroom instructors that were very willing to be assessors. Other instructors thought, I would really like some help. And we're fortunate to have a number of instructional assistants in our ESL department. And so they were just a wonderful benefit. They were all trained as proctors, and they were able to administer the assessment. So any assessor that you have does need to complete the proctor remote testing agreement. So that's done on an annual basis. And you can find the PRTA on the CASAS website. And it doesn't take long at all to complete, but just make sure that you have that on file at your agency. And then the last point is probably the most important. The key requirement is that EL Civics remote testing is done in real time. It needs to be synchronous. Assessments cannot be given as homework. If you're using a learning management system, you can't just post the test on your LMS, whether that's Canvas or Google Classroom. That's not synchronous. You can't just email your student the Google form on Saturday night and expect them to do it in the next few days. You need to be there. You need to have eyes on them. You need that video conferencing platform, whether it's Zoom or something else. This was initially a bit of a I guess you could say, hesitation for us, because we realize, oh, that's going to take a lot of time, especially for those assessments where it needs to be one-to-one, one assessor, one student. But we found some creative ways to deal with some of those challenges, and I want to show you some real life examples that we used. So let's advance here. I will say that I'm not going to share our actual assessments because of test security. So I'm going to be showing you some examples that we used with students to prepare them for this format. Some students are not familiar with things like Google Forms, so it's really important that the instructor or the assessor first provides an example, so you're not testing them on their ability to fill out a Google form. You're actually testing them on what you want to be testing them on, which is the EL Civics portion. So initially, we did most of our assessments through PowerPoint slides. So the assessor would meet with a student, or if it was a written assessment, they would be with a group of students, and they would share their screen, just like what I'm doing right now. And so one of the first slides that we created was to verify identity. So first of all, students would have to show their ID, some form of photo ID, whether it was their college ID or their driver's license or something, just so we could verify their identity, date of birth. We have some students who have the same name. So, just saying their name is not enough. Often we need that date of birth is really important data point. And then also CASAS requires that the student keeps their webcam on or some type of camera device on. And I will say that we have many students who use their cell phone, and a cell phone has a video device on it, right? So that was fine. And so as long as you could see the student, they had that on all the time. And at the beginning of the assessment, we would ask the student to scan the room, just to make sure that they're alone, they're not getting help from anybody, and they don't have like notes on their desk or trying to get answers that way. Okay, so after showing the ID, scanning the room, we also made sure that the student agreed to the following points. And again, this is a requirement from CASAS. So the student has to agree to be the only person in the room during the test, not to get help from other people, not to use notes or dictionaries or other devices to find answers, and really to use their phone or computer camera anytime the assessor asks, whether it's at the beginning or end. And if they agree, they say yes. If they don't agree, well, unfortunately, then you can't test them remotely. So you need to find another solution. But our students, I don't think anybody said no, maybe one student. So I hope that's also true for your situation. And we decided, it's a good idea that we translate this agreement, especially for our lower level students in ESL. Our largest populations are Spanish speaking students and also Vietnamese speaking students. And so you can also see the Spanish version and the Vietnamese version on the bottom of your screen. All right, so I'm going to show you some examples of what we did at our district. And hopefully it will maybe give you some ideas of what you can do with your students, with your student population and the context where you're at. All right, so 48.1 is just a fantastic co-op to do these days, because online communication is so appropriate and so important for our students to learn. So if you haven't investigated this co-op, I would highly encourage you to do so. 48 is just wonderful. So let me show you. Task 1, oral assessment. So students are just going to speak, say the answer. They don't need to write anything. But the student needs to identify online communication forms. They look at the picture, they say what it is. And so this could go quite quickly. the student just says the answer and the assessor will have a checklist and check if it's correct or not correct. So for number 1 example, the @ sign. All the student has to do is say @ and you go on to number 2. Okay, so that would be an example of task 1. And for this co-op, I believe it's beginning low to advanced that do task 1. So this is a really nice task to do remotely. Very efficient, which does become definitely an important factor when you're doing remote assessments. Okay, here's another example, 26.3, health. So we did this back in the spring. This is from an advanced assessment. Here's task 1. This is a written assessment. Find information on low-cost healthcare. You will look at flyers and write the information about the healthcare agencies in a chart. Okay, so right away you're like, okay, how are we going to have our students write something and then get that answer synchronously? So there's a few ways you can do this. While using a PowerPoint slide that you're sharing, we did find it quite effective to have students just get a piece of paper and write it down and then hold up their paper when they're done and would take a screenshot. So we take a picture of their answers. And this worked generally quite well. So the example here, number 1, we want them to copy the chart on their paper. So for this one, name, address, phone number, hours, documentation needed, and services provided. So for advanced, they need to come up with these 6 pieces of information. So here would be the flyer that we would show the student on their PowerPoint. Look at the flyer, fill in the answers on your paper. So they're scanning, okay, what's the name? What's the phone number? What are the hours? And they're writing it down on their paper at home. Okay, once they're done, they've completed the task, then the assessor would ask the student to hold up their paper and the assessor would take a screenshot. So that way they would have the answers. So as I said, generally this worked quite well, but it does depend on the student's device. If the technology is a little older, their camera may not be that great. And it can be hard. It can be pretty difficult sometimes to see the answers. Maybe there's a light shining on and there's glare, or the student didn't position it at, in the right place on their screen. So that was a challenge. And sometimes it worked great. Other times it was just like, I can't read this. Like, I can't read these answers. So we had to figure out a way around that. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Okay, so the first examples I showed you were all PowerPoint slides that the assessor would share. We also did some kind of experimenting with Google Forms, and kind of hesitant to use Google because there's privacy issues. If a student enters their name or their student ID on a Google form, Google now owns that. And, that could be a privacy issue. Another option you might want to check out is Microsoft. They also have forms. So depending on your agency and, at our community college district, we're a Microsoft campus. The problem with the Microsoft forms, though, is they're not as robust as Google. We did try Microsoft, but like putting in images and pictures, it really left a lot to be desired. So it was hard to do flyers like you'll see here. We did 22.6 recreation, and this is from the intermediate low level. And so you see this flyer of Disneyland. So on Google, it worked quite well, and we were able to do that. And you see, the name, the address, the phone number, the website, all of that. So the student in this task needs to find information on cultural and recreational activities. And this was a written assessment. So you can see on the top there, it says 1A, what's the name? Then there's the flyer. And then on the bottom, underneath the flyer, they'll type in their answer. So that's the written part. So what's the name? They type in Disneyland. All right, let me just go back there. What I will say about Google Forms is the data collection is wonderful. It's all done for you. All you need to do is download the Google spreadsheet. It's just like Excel, if you're familiar with Excel, and it has all of the students' answers in there. So that's really nice for record keeping. With the PowerPoints, everything's kind of manual. You need to get screenshots. You need to have checklists if it's an oral test. So it's a little bit more paperwork. Google Forms is very streamlined and efficient. Here's an example from 40.4. We did this back in the summer, citizenship preparation and intermediate low level for this example. This one is a written assessment. Students had to write an email. And the topic is freedom of religion. So some of the freedoms that they're talking about with the citizenship prep. So what does it mean? Give 3 examples and then have a conclusion. And the students needed to include 2 email addresses, right? There's their own email address and then probably their assessor or the instructor. Subject, greeting, closing, and contact information. So those are all on the rubric for this co-op. Now, again, we did allow students to write it out on a piece of paper and then we would take a picture. But what was a little more authentic and easier for us to collect the information was just having students directly email either the assessor or the instructor. And then they're really writing an email and they can include all of these elements, and that worked out very well. All right, so I want to give you some feedback from our assessors. Again, we had teachers do this, we had instructional assistants, proctor, and so we got feedback from everybody during our pilot project. So for example, accessing the PowerPoint and presenting in Zoom was very effective. The slides were easy for the students to see and the font an appropriate size. So most instructors really like the PowerPoint and sharing that in Zoom. They were used to that already, teaching remotely, sharing PowerPoints. The administration of the assessment ranged from 8 minutes to 23 minutes. That was from our beginning low instructor. And again, if it's an oral assessment, it has to be one-to-one, because if you're in a group, the students are going to hear each other. And so that's not secure. So 8 minutes is not bad, right, for one student. That was good to hear. That was the fastest it would take. Some other feedback: allow the students to take a picture of the paper they wrote for the test and then send the picture to the proctor. When I asked the student to show me the paper, I couldn't read it and therefore couldn't take a clear snapshot of it either. Also, it was very difficult for the student to properly line up the paper so I could even try to take a picture of it. So again, that was that difficulty of the students holding a paper and taking a screenshot. And so what we did decide to do is we allowed the student to take their own picture and email it to the instructor. But they had to do it immediately. They couldn't wait and put it off and do it, later that day or tomorrow. Because it's a synchronous test, you got to do it right away. So that was a good workaround and kind of troubleshooting that issue of the picture. All right, labeling and uploading and sending all the documents can take considerable time if someone is doing this for a whole class. Absolutely. A lot of documents that you've got now on your computer and you've got to label them all, and then we would have our proctor send it to our local CASAS office and they would compile all the results, and we would have a grader grade things. So it was a lot of documents and labeling, and it did take time. So again, the Google form is nice that way because it's all in one document. And then lastly, many of my students used a cell phone, which did not hinder the process. It went smoothly. They could see the PowerPoint on their phone. The assessor could still see them on the webcam. We did hear from some of our higher levels that if a student is on a phone and they click on a Google link, there may be an issue with the phone webcam. Now you can no longer see the student. So that was something we did kind of hit that a couple times. I will say that it seemed like the instructors and the instructional assistants preferred the PowerPoints, and so did our students. So even though we created Google Forms, we always still created a PowerPoint just as another option, and that option was usually taken. So that's, I guess, a note of caution about the Google Form with a student on a cell phone. The assessor may not be able to see them once they click the link to the Google Form. So lastly, just a few tips, and some of these come straight from CASAS, others we learned on the way. PowerPoint slides, I would highly encourage you to justify your content, because kind of like in this video, the instructor or the proctor will be up in the top right corner, and that can cover up any of the text or images that you're showing the students. Also make sure the font size is large enough. If a student on a phone, if the font size is 14 or something like that, they're not going to be able to read that. So do make sure that the font size is large enough. If you're having students do writing tasks on a piece of paper, make sure that their pen is dark, black or blue. It's a medium tip, it's not a pencil. For some of the written tasks, like writing an email, why not have them write an email to you or to the proctor? It worked out quite well, I will say. Really important is training the assessors. This is a new process for probably all of us. And so training does need to occur. And there's going to be, there may be some hiccups, that's fine. We're all learning together. Do be aware that there are written tasks, there are oral tasks. Lori Howard has mentioned at some of our Civics meetings that if you're concerned about a task and that it's written and you think that it would work being oral, send her an email or send your CASAS specialist an email and just kind of work through it with them. Ask, is it okay if we assess this orally? Some tasks really do need to be written, like an email needs to be written. But other tasks, you know, the students can show their learning also through oral answers. So send CASAS an email about that and ask them if it's okay for that particular co-op to do either modality. Definitely include practice questions. Make sure your students know how to fill out a Google form if you're going to use that, or with the PowerPoint sharing, that they're familiar with the process. Practice using Google Forms, okay, and then give clear instructions. We found that for some of the lower level students, their piece of paper, they had written everything down, like task 1, identify online communication. And that was taking up a lot of time. So let students know they don't have to write everything down. So just try to be clear about your instructions. Okay, use instructional assistants if you can. No, not everyone has that privilege, but if you're able to get other folks to help your instructor's proctor, that's so helpful because it is time consuming. And then lastly, have a growth mindset. You're probably not going to get it perfect the first time. There's going to be things that you just never thought of because this is such a new process. So go in with an open mind and try it out. And to be honest, we're very pleasantly surprised how well the process went, and our students are really enjoying the Civics instructional material and really don't mind the assessments and even enjoy it. Just want to encourage you, if you haven't started with Civics remote assessments, really give it a try. If you start with one, online communication, again, is a really good one to start with. It's really fun. Students can look at different types of text messaging talk, for example, and emoticons. And it's so applicable and relevant for our day-to-day online communication. All right, well, that's all I have for you today. And I just want to encourage you to check out the EL Civics conference page on the CASAS website. There will be a scheduled Zoom forum Q&A, and the CASAS website address is there for you. So thank you so much for attending. Again, my name is Rita Van Dyke Cow. My email address is there. Please reach out to me if you have any questions, particularly about the co-ops I listed on one of the first slides. I'd love to share ideas and think about ways that we can clearly present the material to our students so that we can assess them fairly and reliably, and it's not a stressful experience for them, but that it's really a learning process, even the assessment itself. So thank you so much again, and have a great EL Civics conference. Bye-bye.